The moment the guards ran was the moment the human made his choice. The first thing Sergeant Daniel Carter noticed about the Imperial Throne Hall was the smell of heated metal and polished stone, the kind of sharp electric scent that always lingered where alien technology hummed quietly beneath the floor. Crystal pillars stretched nearly 40 feet toward a vaulted ceiling filled with drifting light panels that mimicked distant stars, and the polished black floor reflected every movement like still water. Carter stood near the back of the chamber, hands clasped behind him in the relaxed posture of someone who technically didn't belong there. He was only an observer, a liaison from Earth's Defense Council assigned to attend the Empress's diplomatic reception. No armor, no rifle, just a formal Navy uniform and a small translator pin on his collar. Around him, the Empress's royal guard stood in perfect formation, towering figures in silver exosuits with polished helmets and energy lances that glowed faintly blue. To Carter they looked less like soldiers and more like statues placed for decoration. They hadn't moved once in the 20 minutes he'd been watching. At the far end of the hall, elevated on a circular dais of pale crystal, stood the Empress herself. Zyrieth of the Solarian Empire was taller than most humans by nearly a foot, her luminous blue skin catching the starlight above like glass underwater. Gold threads of ceremonial armor traced along her shoulders and arms, elegant rather than intimidating, and her long white hair flowed down her back like a banner caught in slow motion. She spoke calmly with a cluster of diplomats gathered around the dais, her voice low but confident, the tone of someone who had ruled star systems long before humanity had launched its first satellite. Carter watched quietly, studying the room the way soldiers always did. Entrances, sight lines, distances, 20 yards to the nearest exit, 30 feet between each pillar. Plenty of places someone could hide if they wanted to cause trouble. He shifted his weight slightly and glanced up toward one of the upper balconies that curved along the walls about 30 feet above the floor. Something about it felt wrong. Maybe it was instinct. Maybe it was the fact that the royal guards were all focused outward toward the diplomats instead of scanning the entire hall. Either way, the back of his neck prickled with the same warning feeling he used to get on patrol back on Mars Colony. Carter let out a slow breath and muttered under his breath, "Yeah, something's off." Across the chamber, Zyrieth lifted one elegant hand to dismiss a question from a visiting ambassador, her golden eyes briefly scanning the crowd. For half a second those alien eyes met Carter's. He wasn't sure why, but the Empress studied him with a flicker of curiosity before returning her attention to the others. Then the lights flickered. Not much, just a faint pulse overhead like a distant lightning flash behind clouds. Most of the diplomats didn't even notice. But Carter did. His eyes snapped back to the balcony. A small mechanical shape detached from the shadow near the railing, no larger than a dinner plate, hovering silently as it rotated into position. Its targeting lens glowed a dim red as it aligned with the dais. Carter felt time slow the way it sometimes did in emergencies, every detail sharpening with painful clarity. 30 feet above, direct line to the Empress. No guard looking in that direction, and the device was already charging. Carter's heartbeat thumped once against his ribs. "You've got to be kidding me," he whispered. The small machine hovered silently along the balcony rail, its lens glowing brighter as it aligned with the center of the throne dais. From where Daniel Carter stood, the distance was roughly 30 feet above and maybe 60 feet across the hall, an angle most of the royal guards never even considered. Carter felt the familiar tightening in his chest that always came a second before action, the same instinct that had kept him alive during long deployments far from Earth. He glanced around quickly. The alien guards still stood in their ceremonial lines, tall and polished, and completely focused on the crowd below them. None of them were looking up. None of them had noticed the drone slowly adjusting its position like a hawk circling over open ground. Carter took one quiet step forward, then another, pretending to shift his stance so he could see the dais more clearly. The Empress continued speaking with the diplomats as if nothing had changed. Her posture was calm, shoulders straight, luminous blue skin reflecting the soft light above the chamber. To everyone else the evening still looked like a peaceful diplomatic reception. To Carter it looked like a countdown. The drone rotated slightly, mechanical wings stabilizing as the targeting lens brightened to a deeper shade of red. Carter did a quick mental calculation the way soldiers are trained to do. Distance, trajectory, time. Even if he shouted a warning, the sound would travel too slowly across the massive chamber. By the time anyone reacted, the shot would already be on its way. He looked again at the royal guards. There were at least 8 of them surrounding the dais, all nearly 7 feet tall, with advanced armor and energy weapons. On paper, they were some of the most elite protectors in the galaxy. Yet none of them had scanned the balcony once. Carter exhaled slowly through his nose. Back home, his old training officer used to say something simple. Technology makes soldiers confident, but confidence can make them blind. The drone emitted a faint rising hum as its internal systems reached full charge. Carter heard it clearly, even though it was barely louder than a whisper. His eyes flicked toward the nearest exit, measuring the distance automatically. 20 yards to the door. 2 seconds if he sprinted. He could walk away right now. No one would blame him. He was not part of the Empress's security detail. He was not even carrying a weapon. Officially, he was just a diplomatic observer from Earth. The responsibility belonged to the Royal Guard. Carter looked back toward the dais. The Empress Zyriev had just turned slightly to address a different ambassador, her long white hair shifting gently over the golden armor at her shoulders. For a brief moment, the entire room felt strangely quiet, like the pause before a thunderstorm breaks. Carter shook his head slightly and muttered to himself, "Figures." The drone tilted downward. The red lens centered perfectly on the Empress's chest. Somewhere across the chamber, a musician continued playing a soft instrumental melody, completely unaware that history was about to change in the span of a single heartbeat. Carter's muscles tensed as adrenaline surged through him. The royal guards finally began to notice something was wrong, their helmets turning upward in confusion. But they were too late. The drone had already locked its target, and Daniel Carter understood, with absolute certainty, that within the next second someone in that room was going to make a choice that could not be undone. The drone released its charge. With a sharp mechanical pulse that echoed faintly against the crystal pillars, a streak of light crossing the throne hall faster than most eyes could follow. Daniel Carter moved before the diplomats even understood something had happened. Years of training pushed his body forward without waiting for permission from his brain. The polished black floor slid beneath his boots as he broke into a sprint across the chamber, the distance between him and the dais shrinking with every stride. Around him, chairs scraped against stone as the crowd reacted in confusion, voices rising in alarm as the royal guards finally realized what was unfolding above them. Their helmets turned upward toward the balcony, energy lances lifting too late. Carter barely noticed them. His entire focus narrowed to a single point at the center of the hall, where Empress Zyriev still stood on the raised crystal platform, her golden eyes widening as she sensed the sudden shift in the room. For a brief second, the world seemed strangely quiet. Carter could hear his own breathing, steady and controlled, the same rhythm he had practiced through years of drills back on Earth. 60 feet across the chamber. 40 feet now. The drone's light cut through the air like a silver thread. Someone shouted a warning in a language Carter did not understand, but the meaning was clear enough. Several diplomats stepped backward in panic, robes sweeping across the reflective floor as they tried to move away from the dais. The Empress did not move. Whether it was shock or royal composure, Carter could not tell. She simply stood there, tall and still, her white hair catching the glow of the chamber lights. Carter saw the path the projectile was taking with perfect clarity. Straight line. Direct trajectory. No obstacle between it and the Empress. The guards on either side of the dais finally reacted, their armored boots pounding against the stone as they rushed forward, but the timing was already lost. Even with their advanced suits, they could not cross the distance quickly enough. Carter felt the air rush past his face as he pushed harder, the familiar burn building in his lungs. 30 feet now. 20. Every instinct in his mind told him that what he was about to do made absolutely no sense. He was not sworn to this empire. He had not grown up under this Empress's rule. Back home on Earth, there were 100 people who would remind him that his job here was observation, not heroics. Yet the thought barely crossed his mind before fading away. Because there was something simpler underneath it all, something older than politics or alliances. If someone was in danger, and you were the only one close enough to help, you did not stand still and watch. That was the rule Carter had lived by since the first day he put on a uniform. 10 feet. The dais rose ahead of him like a wall of pale crystal. The glowing streak from the drone closed the final gap. In the same instant, Carter launched himself forward. His shoulders slammed against the smooth edge of the platform as he pushed upward, momentum carrying him directly into the path of the incoming shot. For a single suspended moment, everything froze. The projectile struck the reinforced panel beneath Carter's uniform with a heavy impact that knocked the breath from his chest and spun him sideways across the platform. The energy dispersed harmlessly across the protective plating hidden beneath the fabric, but the force was enough to send him collapsing onto one knee. A ripple of shocked silence swept through the throne hall. Carter blinked slowly, catching his breath as the world rushed back into motion around him. The Empress stood only a few feet away now, staring down at him with an expression he had never seen on an alien face before. It was not anger. It was not fear. It was something closer to disbelief. Carter managed a tired grin and looked up at her. "Your security team might want to check the balcony," he said quietly as the royal guards finally surrounded the dais. For several seconds the throne hall remained completely silent except for the faint hum of the hovering drone above, which now drifted uncertainly as its systems recalculated after the failed strike. Daniel Carter stayed on one knee, one hand pressed against the smooth crystal floor as he pulled in a slow breath and let the shock of the impact fade from his chest. The reinforced panel hidden beneath his formal uniform had done exactly what it was designed to do, but the force of the hit still felt like someone had swung a heavy door directly into his ribs. Across the dais, the royal guards finally reacted with explosive urgency. 8 towering figures rushed forward, silver armor clattering softly as they formed a protective ring around the Empress. Their energy lances lifted toward the balcony, glowing brighter as targeting systems activated. 2 guards launched upward using short bursts from the thrusters built into their armor, rising nearly 30 feet to the curved balcony where the small machine hovered. The drone attempted to adjust its position, its red targeting lens flickering as if searching for another opening, but the guards surrounded it within seconds and shut down its power core with a precise disabling pulse. The red light vanished. The machine dropped harmlessly onto the polished stone of the balcony floor. Down below, the chamber slowly came back to life. Diplomats whispered nervously to one another, some backing away from the dais while others stared in stunned silence at the human who had crossed the hall faster than any of them had thought possible. Carter finally pushed himself upright, wincing slightly as he rolled his shoulders and tested his breathing. Nothing broken, just bruised pride and probably a few sore muscles in the morning. He brushed invisible dust from the front of his uniform and turned his attention back to the Empress. Zyriev had not moved from where she stood. Her golden eyes were fixed on him with a level of focus that made the entire room seem distant. Up close, Carter noticed details he had not seen before from across the hall. The faint iridescent pattern along her skin that shimmered like starlight beneath water. The thin lines of ceremonial gold along her armor that formed symbols he could not read. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The royal guards around the dais seemed unsure whether to pull Carter away or simply keep watching. Finally, the Empress stepped forward one pace, her voice calm, but carrying easily through the chamber. "Human," she said slowly, the translator in Carter's collar adjusting the tone of her language into clear English. "You were not assigned to my protection." Carter gave a small shrug, still catching his breath. "That is true, Your Majesty." Zyriev studied him carefully, her expression thoughtful rather than angry. "Then explain why you placed yourself between me and that attack." Carter glanced toward the balcony where the disabled drone now lay surrounded by guards, then looked back at the Empress with the same tired half-smile he often used when answering questions from commanding officers. "Where I come from," he said simply. "If you see something about to go wrong, you do not wait for paperwork." A ripple of quiet murmurs passed through the diplomats. The royal guards exchanged brief glances through their helmet visors as if uncertain how to respond to that answer. Zyriev remained still for several seconds longer, absorbing the words as though they represented a concept she had not encountered before. Then her gaze shifted briefly to the spot on Carter's uniform where the reinforced panel had absorbed the strike. When she spoke again, her voice carried a different tone, one that held both curiosity and a quiet measure of respect. "Your species is far more unusual than our reports suggested. Carter rubbed the back of his neck and looked around at the stunned faces in the chamber. Yeah, he said softly, we get that a lot. The throne hall slowly filled with sound again, not loud at first but spreading like ripples across water as diplomats began whispering to one another, their voices carrying curiosity, confusion, and a growing sense that they had just witnessed something none of them had expected to see. Sergeant Daniel Carter stood at the center of the crystal dais, surrounded by the towering figures of the Imperial Guard, yet none of them seemed certain what to do with him. Their helmets tilted slightly, as if analyzing a puzzle that did not fit their training manuals. Above them on the balcony, technicians carefully secured the disabled drone and carried it away, while several guards scanned every inch of the hall for additional threats. Carter glanced up briefly, satisfied that the immediate danger was gone, then shifted his weight and rolled his shoulders again. The ache in his chest had settled into a dull pressure, the kind that reminded him he would probably feel this moment tomorrow morning when the adrenaline wore off. Across from him, Empress Zaryeth remained composed, though the intensity in her golden eyes had not faded. The hall's soft starlight reflected across her blue skin and white hair, giving her a presence that seemed almost unreal against the dark crystal floor. She took another measured step closer, the motion causing the royal guards to part slightly so that she could approach the human without obstruction. The movement drew even more attention from the watching diplomats. Carter straightened instinctively, the old habit of standing respectfully before authority returning without conscious thought. Zaryeth stopped a few feet away from him and studied him again, this time with the quiet patience of someone examining a rare artifact. For several seconds, she said nothing, as if considering a question she had never needed to ask before. Finally she spoke. In our empire, she said slowly, a protector is chosen through years of training and sworn loyalty. They are bound by duty to stand where danger appears. Her gaze dropped briefly to the place on Carter's uniform, where the reinforced panel rested beneath the fabric. You carry no such oath here. Carter gave a small nod. That is correct. One of the royal guards shifted slightly beside the dais, clearly waiting for instructions from the Empress. Yet Zaryeth did not look at them. Her attention remained on the human soldier who had crossed the entire chamber in a single moment without being ordered to do so. Then I must ask again, she continued, her tone calm but unmistakably serious. What compelled you to act? Carter rubbed his chin thoughtfully, glancing around the hall at the dozens of alien faces still watching the exchange. He knew his answer would probably sound too simple for a place like this, surrounded by diplomats and rulers from worlds he had only read about in briefing files. But the truth rarely changed just because the room became more important. He looked back at the Empress and spoke in the same relaxed tone he had used earlier. Back home we call it responsibility. Zaryeth tilted her head slightly, the translator converting the subtle shift in her voice into clear English. Responsibility without command. Carter nodded once. Someone had to move. That was me. The simplicity of the answer seemed to ripple through the chamber again. Several diplomats exchanged quiet comments while the royal guard stood motionless, their posture suggesting they were processing a concept that did not align with their understanding of loyalty. Zaryeth remained silent for a moment longer, then lifted her gaze toward the vast ceiling where the artificial stars glowed softly above the throne hall. When she spoke again, her voice carried a thoughtful calm that reached every corner of the chamber. Perhaps, she said slowly, there is more strength in your species than our historians realized. Carter gave a modest shrug, glancing briefly toward the balcony where the disabled drone had been removed. We are still figuring that out ourselves. The throne hall did not return to its earlier celebration. The music had stopped entirely, leaving only the quiet hum of the palace energy systems and the soft shifting of robes as diplomats slowly regained their composure. What had been a ceremonial reception now felt more like the aftermath of an unexpected test. Sergeant Daniel Carter stood on the crystal dais beside the Empress while the Imperial Guards expanded their perimeter across the chamber, scanning every balcony, corridor, and entrance with far more urgency than before. Above, several technicians continued examining the balcony where the small drone had appeared. From the fragments of conversation drifting through Carter's translator, it was clear that the machine had not belonged to any known faction within the Empire. That detail alone made the atmosphere heavier. Carter rested his hands on his hips for a moment and glanced across the enormous hall. The polished black floor reflected the towering crystal columns and the artificial stars overhead so clearly that the entire room seemed suspended between two skies. A strange place to nearly lose a ruler, he thought quietly. Behind him, the Empress had not moved far from where she had stood during the incident. Zyreth observed the activity unfolding across her throne hall with the composed stillness of someone accustomed to command. Yet Carter could sense a different kind of attention in the way her gaze occasionally returned to him. Not suspicion, something closer to evaluation. One of the royal guards approached the dais and knelt briefly before speaking in the Solarian language. Carter's translator captured only fragments as the soldier reported that the drone's internal systems had been carefully disguised and remotely triggered from somewhere outside the palace network. Zyreth listened without interruption. When the guard finished, she gave a small nod and dismissed him. The armored figure rose and returned to the perimeter. For several seconds the Empress remained silent again, her eyes following the distant technicians on the balcony. Then she spoke without turning. Sergeant Carter. The use of his title caught him slightly off guard. He straightened automatically. Yes, Your Majesty. Zyreth finally looked at him again. Up close her golden eyes carried a calm intensity that reminded Carter of experienced commanders he had served under during earlier deployments. Our intelligence reports described humans as ambitious, adaptable, and often unpredictable, she said thoughtfully. But they did not describe this. Carter gave a small, amused breath. Most reports miss a few things. Zyreth studied him for another moment. You acted without hesitation. Training helps, Carter replied simply. An instinct. The Empress considered the word as if weighing its meaning. Around them the hall continued to settle. Several diplomats were already quietly departing under the guidance of palace attendants. Their conversations hushed, but clearly focused on the extraordinary moment they had just witnessed. The throne hall that had been filled with ceremony an hour earlier now carried the quiet tension of a place where something important had shifted. Zyreth turned slightly, looking across the vast chamber as though seeing it through a new perspective. In my empire, she said slowly, protectors serve because they are commanded. Her gaze returned to Carter. You serve because you chose to. Carter shrugged gently. Sometimes that is the same thing. The Empress remained silent for a few seconds longer before giving a subtle signal to one of the nearby officers. The guard stepped forward immediately. Ensure that Sergeant Carter remains within the palace tonight, Zyreth instructed calmly. Not as a prisoner. Her eyes flicked briefly toward Carter again. As a guest whose actions require further understanding. Carter raised an eyebrow slightly, but nodded. I can live with that. Zyreth allowed the faintest hint of a smile before turning back toward the throne hall, where the investigation into the mysterious drone had only just begun. The throne hall gradually emptied as palace attendants guided the remaining diplomats toward the outer corridors, their footsteps echoing softly across the polished crystal floor. What had once been a crowded chamber filled with conversation now felt vast and quiet, the artificial stars above reflecting across the black stone like distant galaxies. Sergeant Daniel Carter followed one of the Imperial guards away from the dais, his boots tapping lightly against the floor as he was escorted through the immense chamber toward a tall archway carved into the palace wall. The guard walking beside him was nearly 7 feet tall even without the armor, his silver exosuit casting faint reflections of the chamber lights as he moved with precise discipline. Carter noticed that the soldier remained silent, though the visor of his helmet occasionally turned slightly toward him as if still studying the unusual human, who had disrupted an assassination attempt without being ordered to do so. Beyond the throne hall the palace corridors stretched wide and luminous, their curved walls formed from smooth crystal panels that glowed with soft blue light. The air inside the palace carried a faint metallic scent mixed with something floral that Carter could not quite identify. He had seen many military installations across several colonies, but nothing about this place resembled a fortress. It felt more like walking through the interior of a living starship designed by artists rather than engineers. After several minutes the guard stopped beside a tall door that slid open silently into a private observation chamber overlooking the capital city far below. Through the wide, transparent wall Carter could see thousands of lights stretching across the horizon of the alien world. their reflections shimmering against layers of elevated highways and floating transit platforms. Far in the distance, several orbital shuttles moved slowly through the upper atmosphere like glowing comets. Carter let out a quiet breath as he stepped inside. Not a bad view, he murmured to himself. The guard remained at the entrance, standing perfectly still as if carved from the same crystal as the palace walls. Carter walked closer to the window and rested his hands lightly against the railing. From this height, the entire capital city looked peaceful, almost fragile. It was strange to think that only an hour earlier someone had tried to disrupt the stability of this entire empire with a machine no larger than a dinner plate. The door behind him opened again with a soft mechanical tone. Carter turned slightly as Empress Zyriev entered the chamber without ceremony. She was no longer surrounded by diplomats or guards, and without the crowded throne hall around her, she appeared even taller and more striking beneath the pale glow of the observation room. The guard at the doorway bowed his head and stepped outside, leaving the chamber quiet except for the distant hum of the city far below. Zyriev walked slowly to the window beside Carter and looked out across her capital. For several moments, neither of them spoke. Finally, she said, "You study the city as though it belongs to someone else." Carter gave a small smile. "In a way it does." Zyriev turned her golden eyes toward him. "You placed yourself in danger for a ruler whose world you do not share." Carter shrugged lightly and glanced back out at the endless lights. "Does not matter what world it is." The Empress considered that answer carefully, her gaze drifting across the city again. "Perhaps," she said quietly, "that is why your kind unsettles so many civilizations." Carter folded his arms and leaned slightly against the railing. "We have that effect sometimes." Zyriev watched him in silence for another moment before speaking again. "Tell me, Sergeant Carter, when you ran across that hall today, did you believe you would survive?" Carter thought about the question for a second, then gave a relaxed shrug. "Honestly, Your Majesty, I did not stop long enough to think about it." The Empress studied him with a thoughtful expression as the lights of the alien capital flickered beneath them like a sea of distant stars. The observation chamber remained quiet as the lights of the alien capital stretched endlessly beneath the transparent wall, thousands of luminous pathways weaving through the night like rivers of moving stars. Sergeant Daniel Carter rested his forearms lightly on the smooth railing, watching the distant traffic lanes where silent transports glided between floating platforms more than a mile below. The air in the room carried a calm stillness that felt completely different from the tension that had filled the throne hall earlier. Behind him, the palace corridors hummed faintly with activity as security teams continued their investigation. But inside the chamber, the only sound was the low atmospheric circulation of the building itself. Empress Zyriev stood beside him without speaking for several moments, her posture straight yet relaxed as she studied the humans standing within her private observation room. From this distance, she could see details that had escaped her earlier in the crowded hall. The faint scuff marks on his boots from years of service. The quiet steadiness in the way he held himself even after the shock of the incident. To her people, protectors were trained to display discipline, but this human carried something slightly different. It was not obedience. It was conviction. Zyriev finally turned her gaze back toward the city lights. "My historians once described humanity as a young civilization," she said slowly. "Impatient, resilient, and capable of surprising ambition." Carter gave a small nod without looking away from the view. "That sounds about right." The Empress folded her hands loosely behind her back. "Yet none of those descriptions explain what happened today." Carter considered the statement for a moment before answering. "Sometimes reports focus on the big picture and miss the smaller details." Zyriev glanced at him again. "And what detail did they miss?" Carter straightened slightly and looked across the distant skyline. "Most humans are raised with a simple idea. If someone is in trouble and you are close enough to help, you help. Does not matter who they are." The Empress absorbed the explanation carefully. For an empire that had existed for thousands of years, her civilization had built entire systems around duty and hierarchy. Orders flowed downward through the structure of command, and loyalty was measured through obedience. What the human described sounded almost dangerously unpredictable. "Your philosophy relies heavily on personal choice," she observed. Carter nodded. "Choice is part of it." Zyriev walked slowly along the edge of the observation window, her reflection gliding across the transparent wall as she studied the glowing city below. "In my empire," she said thoughtfully, "protectors do not act until their role demands it. Discipline prevents chaos." Carter smiled faintly. "On Earth we learned that sometimes waiting for the perfect moment means missing the only moment that matters." The Empress paused and looked at him again, her golden eyes reflecting the lights of the city. "You believe action should come before certainty." Carter shrugged. "Sometimes certainty arrives too late." The quiet statement lingered between them. Outside, one of the distant orbital shuttles descended slowly toward a landing platform nearly 3 miles away, its engines glowing softly against the dark sky. Zyriev followed the movement with her eyes, then turned back to the human soldier who had crossed an entire throne hall without hesitation. "Your presence today prevented a disruption that could have echoed across my empire," she said calmly. "Yet you claim your decision required little thought." Carter leaned back against the railing and folded his arms loosely. "Thinking too much can slow you down." Zyriev studied him carefully, as though examining a concept rather than a person. Finally, she spoke again in a quieter tone. "There may be consequences to what happened tonight, Sergeant Carter. An attack like that rarely stands alone." Carter nodded once, his expression steady. "I figured as much." The Empress looked out across the city again, the distant lights reflecting in her eyes. "Then perhaps," she said slowly, "your instincts will be required again before this matter is resolved." Carter allowed himself a small, thoughtful smile as he watched the endless city below. "That tends to happen more often than I planned for." The observation chamber remained dim and peaceful while the vast alien capital stretched beneath the transparent wall like an endless ocean of light. Sergeant Daniel Carter continued watching the distant traffic streams glide between floating platforms, each transport leaving thin glowing trails across the night sky. From this height, the city looked calm and orderly, but Carter had spent enough years in uniform to understand that calm cities often hid complicated tensions beneath the surface. Behind him, Empress Zarieth stood silently for several seconds longer, studying the human with a quiet intensity that had not faded since the moment he crossed the throne hall. The air in the chamber carried a low mechanical hum from the palace energy systems, steady and almost soothing after the sudden chaos earlier that evening. Carter finally straightened from the railing and stretched his shoulders slightly, testing the lingering ache where the protective panel beneath his uniform had absorbed the drone strike. It was nothing serious, but the reminder of that moment remained clear in his mind. Zyriev noticed the small movement. "You are still feeling the impact," she observed calmly. Carter gave a faint smile. It was a strong reminder that standing in front of moving objects is not always the smartest plan. The Empress studied him with mild curiosity. "Yet you did not hesitate." Carter leaned lightly against the railing again and glanced across the glowing city. "Sometimes hesitation costs more than action." Zyriev absorbed the statement, her expression thoughtful. For a civilization that had evolved around structured command and carefully measured responses, the idea of acting before certainty remained unusual. Yet the evidence of that philosophy stood directly beside her. Carter noticed her silence and shifted the subject slightly. "Have your investigators figured out where the drone came from?" Zyriev turned toward the city again before answering. "Not yet. Its systems were deliberately masked. Whoever arranged the attack understood our palace security protocols very well." Carter nodded slowly. "Inside knowledge, then." The Empress did not immediately respond, but the faint tightening in her posture suggested the same conclusion had already formed in her mind. Outside the observation window, a long line of transports moved along a floating highway nearly 2 miles below, their lights forming a bright ribbon across the dark landscape. Carter followed the movement for a moment before speaking again. If someone inside the Empire planned this, they were counting on surprise. That advantage is gone now. Zyriev glanced at him. "You speak as though the event has already become a larger conflict." Carter shrugged slightly. "That is usually how these things unfold." The Empress folded her hands behind her back, her gaze returning to the endless city lights. "My council will begin its own investigation before sunrise." Carter nodded. "Good. Because whoever sent that drone will probably want to know whether it worked." Zyriev considered that quietly. "And if they learn that it did not?" Carter gave a thoughtful half-smile. "Then they will likely try again with a different approach." The calm honesty in his tone seemed to interest the Empress even more. She stepped closer to the observation wall, the lights of the capital reflecting across her luminous blue skin. You speak with remarkable certainty for someone who arrived on this world only yesterday. Carter folded his arms loosely. Human history is full of situations that follow similar patterns. Zyriev looked at him again, studying the steady confidence in his expression. For the first time since the throne hall incident, a subtle sense of anticipation replaced the quiet curiosity in her gaze. Then perhaps your experience will prove useful, she said slowly. Carter raised one eyebrow slightly. That depends on what happens next. Zyriev allowed a faint, knowing smile to appear as she looked back across the sprawling alien capital. Sergeant Carter, she said softly. Something tells me that what happens next will involve you whether you intend it or not. Carter looked out across the glowing city and gave a quiet sigh that carried equal parts humor and resignation. Yeah, he murmured. That sounds about right. The observation chamber remained quiet long after the last shuttle lights faded across the distant skyline, and the capital city below settled into the slower rhythm of the late night hours. Sergeant Daniel Carter still stood near the transparent wall, watching the endless pattern of lights shift across the horizon while the low hum of the palace systems filled the room with a steady mechanical calm. Somewhere deep inside the massive structure, security teams continued their investigation, but from this height, the Empire's capital looked peaceful, almost untouched by the uncertainty that had unfolded earlier in the throne hall. Carter folded his arms loosely and let his eyes follow a cargo transport drifting across the sky nearly 3 miles away before disappearing behind one of the floating transit platforms. Beside him, Empress Zariev remained silent for several moments, her attention divided between the city and the human soldier who had unexpectedly altered the course of the evening. The glow of the distant streets reflected faintly across her blue skin, giving her an almost ethereal presence against the dark glass of the observation wall. Finally she spoke again, her voice calm but carrying a thoughtful weight. My advisors will ask me tomorrow why a human soldier now stands within the inner palace instead of returning to his delegation quarters. Carter glanced sideways at her and gave a small shrug. You could tell them I got lost. Zyriev allowed a faint breath that might have been amusement before her expression returned to its composed seriousness. They will not believe that explanation. Carter nodded once. That sounds about right. The Empress stepped closer to the observation window and looked out across the immense city below. This empire has endured for thousands of years, she said slowly. It has survived conflicts, rival factions, and political storms that reshaped entire star systems. Carter listened quietly, sensing that her words carried more meaning than a simple historical observation. Zyriev continued, Yet the most dangerous moments in history rarely arrive with large fleets or open declarations. They begin quietly, hidden behind ordinary events. Carter considered that for a moment, like a small machine drifting above a balcony. Zyriev inclined her head slightly in agreement. Exactly. The silence between them returned for a few seconds while a distant transport crossed the skyline below. Carter finally shifted his stance and rested his hands on the railing again. If someone inside the Empire arranged tonight's attack, they were testing something. Zyriev looked at him. Testing. Carter nodded slowly. Testing security. Testing response time. Maybe even testing loyalty. The Empress did not answer immediately, but her eyes narrowed slightly as she absorbed the possibility. In a civilization built on hierarchy and duty, the idea of internal betrayal was not something she spoke about lightly. Carter continued calmly. Back home we have a saying. When someone tries something small first, it usually means they are measuring how far they can. Go next. Zyriev watched the city lights for a long moment before speaking again. You believe tonight was only the beginning. Carter gave a thoughtful nod. It usually is. The Empress turned away from the window and faced him directly. The quiet curiosity she had shown earlier had now shifted into something more deliberate. Then perhaps your instincts will serve a purpose beyond a single moment of courage. Carter raised an eyebrow slightly. That sounds like the beginning of an assignment. Zyriev studied him carefully before answering. Perhaps it is the beginning of understanding. Carter let out a quiet breath and looked once more at the sprawling capital city beneath them. In the distance, Thousands of lights continued moving across the alien skyline, unaware that the balance of an entire empire might already be shifting in ways none of them could see. He rubbed the back of his neck and gave a small, resigned smile. "Well," he said calmly, "if trouble really is just getting started, it looks like I picked the wrong night to stand in the front row." The observation chamber grew quieter as the night deepened across the alien capital, the endless web of lights below slowly shifting into calmer patterns as transit lanes thinned and distant towers dimmed their outer illumination. Sergeant Daniel Carter remained near the transparent wall, studying the city with the patient awareness of someone who had spent years learning how to read unfamiliar environments. Even from several hundred stories above the surface, he could sense that the capital was more than a place of beauty. It was the center of a vast empire, and somewhere within its endless structures, someone had chosen to test the limits of that empire's stability. Behind him, Empress moved slowly across the chamber, her steps quiet against the polished floor as she approached a narrow console built into the curved wall. With a single motion of her hand, a series of holographic displays appeared above the surface, each one projecting faint blue light into the dim room. Carter glanced over his shoulder as the glowing images expanded into layered security reports and surveillance recordings taken from the throne hall earlier that evening. From across the room, he could recognize the moment immediately. The balcony, the hovering drone, the instant when everything had changed. Zyrieth studied the projection with calm concentration, her golden eyes following the recorded motion of the machine as it aligned with the dais. The visual replay showed the chamber from above, a perspective that made the entire event look strangely quiet and clinical. Carter watched himself cross the hall in the recording, the movement appearing almost reckless from that angle. He rubbed the back of his neck. "Looks faster from up there," he said quietly. Zyrieth glanced briefly toward him before returning her attention to the display. "It was faster than any of my guards reacted." Carter did not respond immediately. He understood the weight behind that observation. In an empire built on discipline, even a small failure of response carried serious meaning. Zyrieth expanded another section of the projection, revealing the moment the drone had powered down on the balcony. Several additional data streams appeared beside it, each representing a security trace from the palace network. Carter stepped away from the window and walked closer, studying the information with interest. "Have your analysts found the control signal yet?" he asked. Zyrieth shook her head slowly. The signal was routed through several relay systems across the city. Whoever arranged the attempt planned their escape path carefully. Carter folded his arms as he watched the streams of data shifting across the holographic surface. "That means the operator is still somewhere out there." Zyrieth turned toward him again. "You speak as though this outcome is inevitable." Carter gave a small shrug. "When someone goes to this much trouble, they usually stay close enough to watch the results." The Empress absorbed that quietly before dismissing the holographic displays with a subtle gesture. The chamber returned to its dim stillness. Outside the observation wall, another orbital shuttle crossed the night sky, its faint engine glow reflecting across the glass. Zyrieth walked back toward the window and looked down at her capital city once more. "You continue to think like a soldier even while standing in a palace," she observed. Carter leaned lightly against the railing beside her. "A soldier does not stop thinking just because the scenery changes." Zyrieth considered that answer for several seconds before speaking again. "If you are correct, then whoever arranged tonight's attempt may already be watching how we respond." Carter followed her gaze across the distant skyline. "That would be my guess." The Empress remained silent for a moment, her expression calm but focused as the lights of the Empire's capital flickered. "Beneath them," finally she said, almost to herself. "Then perhaps the most interesting question is not who attempted the strike." Carter glanced at her. "What is the other question?" Zyrieth looked toward the city again, her voice steady and thoughtful. "Why they believed tonight was the right moment to begin." The observation chamber remained wrapped in quiet while the capital city stretched endlessly beneath the palace, its distant lights glowing like a living constellation across the dark landscape. Sergeant Daniel Carter stood beside the transparent wall, his eyes following the slow movement of traffic lanes that floated nearly 2 miles below the palace towers. The steady rhythm of the city gave the illusion of normalcy, But Carter had spent enough years observing fragile political situations to recognize when calm was only temporary. Beside him, Empress Zarieth remained still, her gaze fixed on the distant skyline, while the faint glow of the city reflected across her blue skin and white hair. The question she had spoken lingered in the air between them like a puzzle waiting to be solved. Carter folded his arms loosely and considered it carefully. If someone chose tonight to start something, he said quietly, then tonight probably had meaning to them. Zarieth turned her golden eyes toward him. Meaning? Carter nodded once. Timing is rarely random when someone takes a risk like that. The Empress studied him for a moment before asking, what kind of timing would create such a moment? Carter leaned slightly against the railing as he looked across the city again. Something important happening. Something that changes the balance of power. Zarieth remained silent for several seconds while the distant lights of the capital shimmered below them. Finally she spoke. Earlier this evening the throne hall held representatives from 20 different star systems. Carter glanced at her. A diplomatic reception. Zarieth inclined her head. More than that. The council was preparing to announce a new alliance between our empire and several frontier colonies. Carter slowly nodded. That would shift influence across a lot of territory. Zarieth's expression grew more thoughtful. Exactly. The realization settled between them with quiet clarity. Whoever had arranged the drone strike had not chosen the moment randomly. They had chosen it because the Empire was about to strengthen its position in the galaxy. Carter looked down at the city again, following the distant path of a cargo shuttle descending toward one of the floating ports. Someone out there did not want that alliance to happen, he said calmly. Zarieth remained silent, but her posture confirmed the same conclusion. Carter continued. If the strike had worked, the announcement would never have happened. The entire political landscape could have shifted overnight. Zarieth looked toward the horizon where the faint curve of the planet's upper atmosphere glowed softly against space. Such a disruption could invite chaos across several regions. Carter gave a small nod. And chaos creates opportunities for the people who planned it. The Empress turned toward him again. For the first time since they entered the observation chamber, there was a deeper intensity behind her calm expression, as if the situation had moved from theory into something far more personal. You understand the pattern quickly, she said quietly. Carter offered a small shrug. History repeats itself more often than people like to admit. Zarieth studied him for several seconds before speaking again. Then you believe tonight's attempt was meant to stop the alliance before it could begin. Carter met her gaze with quiet certainty. That would be my guess. The Empress looked back across the vast city once more while the lights continued their endless movement across the alien landscape. Somewhere in that immense network of towers and transit platforms, someone had tried to change the course of an empire. Zarieth finally spoke again, her voice calm, but carrying a new sense of resolve. If that is true, then whoever arranged this will not simply disappear. Carter watched the distant skyline and allowed a faint, thoughtful smile. People who plan something this big rarely stop after the first attempt. The Empress nodded slowly, her golden eyes reflecting the endless lights below. Then it appears, she said quietly, that tonight has only revealed the opening move. Carter looked out across the sleeping capital and exhaled softly. Yeah, he said, that is usually how the game starts. The observation chamber remained still as the final hours of the night settled over the alien capital, the immense city stretching to the horizon beneath a blanket of distant stars. From the towering height of the palace, the glowing highways and floating platforms looked almost peaceful, their steady movement giving no hint that the balance of an empire might already be shifting beneath the surface. Sergeant Daniel Carter rested his hands lightly on the smooth railing as he watched the city breathe far below. The cool glass of the observation wall reflected both the endless skyline and the tall figure of Empress Zarieth standing beside him. For several minutes neither of them spoke. The quiet had a different feeling now. Earlier it had been curiosity and reflection. Now it carried a sense of decision. Finally Zarieth moved away from the window and walked slowly across the chamber, her footsteps calm and measured against the polished floor. She stopped near the center of the room and turned back toward Carter, the faint light of the city outlining her silhouette. Sergeant Carter, she said calmly. In the history of my empire there are moments when events reveal truths that cannot be ignored. Carter glanced over his shoulder at her. Sounds like the start of an important speech. Zaryeth allowed a small, almost amused breath before continuing. Tonight I witnessed something my advisors did not predict. Carter straightened slightly. And what was that? The Empress studied him carefully before answering. A soldier who crossed an entire throne hall to protect someone he did not serve. Carter rubbed the back of his neck. Where I come from, that kind of thing happens more often than people think. Zaryeth stepped closer again until they both stood near the observation wall once more. The capital city glowed beneath them like a living map of the empire she ruled. In my world, she said quietly, loyalty is created by duty, rank, and command. She turned her gaze toward him. But what you demonstrated tonight came from something else entirely. Carter shrugged gently. Call it habit. Zaryeth looked back across the city and shook her head slightly. No, habit alone does not cause someone to act before thought. Carter considered responding but decided against it. Instead, he simply watched the endless lights of the capital stretching across the planet's surface. After a moment, Zaryeth spoke again, her voice calm but carrying a quiet certainty. You told me earlier that people who plan an attack like this rarely stop after one attempt. Carter nodded once. That is usually how these stories go. The Empress remained silent for a moment before speaking again. Then it would be wise for me to have someone nearby who recognizes danger before others see it. Carter slowly turned toward her. Your Majesty, I think your empire already has thousands of soldiers for that job. Zaryeth met his gaze with a calm confidence that made the answer clear before she spoke it. Tonight those soldiers hesitated. Carter held her gaze for a moment before giving a quiet breath that carried both understanding and resignation. And the human did not. Zaryeth nodded slightly. Exactly. The two of them stood together in silence while the distant city lights continued their endless motion across the dark landscape. Somewhere far below, millions of citizens slept peacefully, unaware that their empire had narrowly avoided a crisis only hours earlier. Carter looked out across the skyline once more before speaking quietly. You know, he said, where I come from people say the universe is a big place. Zaryeth glanced toward him, and Carter gave a small smile as he watched another shuttle cross the horizon nearly 3 miles away. Turns out trouble can still find you no matter how big it is. Zaryeth followed his gaze across the sleeping capital and answered with calm certainty. Then it is fortunate that tonight the trouble encountered a human who chose to stand in its way. The lights of the alien city shimmered beneath them, while the first faint glow of dawn began to rise along the distant horizon, marking the quiet beginning of a new day for an empire that would never again look at humanity in quite the same way.